Good afternoon. My name is Melissa, and my topic of choice was the death penalty. Now, there are many controversial aspects revolving this topic in specific. Some people may be against it because they believe it is morally wrong to put somebody to death. Some people are in favor of it because they believe it deters crime. I am against the death penalty, and my main claim is that the death penalty is actually an ineffective way of punishment. I will be supporting my claim with three main points. My first main point is that the police department runs a risk of executing innocent people. Now, we all know there are many cases in the United States where innocent people are put in jail because of many reasons, one being insufficient evidence to point elsewhere, or two, the police are desperate to put a face and a name on a crime that has been committed. So we all know that the death penalty is irreversible. So if one is sentenced to the death penalty and killed, they cannot be brought back from the dead. So how would the police explain to that person's family that they made a mistake or it was an accident? So one can easily be bailed out of jail from like in a couple weeks or in a couple days, but they cannot be, as I said, brought back from the dead once they are executed. In an article called When Innocent People Are Wrongfully Convicted of a Crime That Never Happened by Jessica Henry, she states that nearly 1/3 of exonerations involve wrongful conviction of an innocent person. So this further proves that the system does still fail, and it may seem to fall through the cracks, and people that have not committed a crime they are accused of are still being punished with death. My second point is that overall it costs more for the police department to execute someone than to keep them in prison. In an article I found called "The Cost of the Death Penalty," the author states that the U.S. Spends more money on cases that involve the death penalty compared to cases without the death penalty. So cases without the death penalty cost around $74,000, whereas cases involving the death penalty cost around $1.26 million. So off the bat, you can see it costs significantly more money to put somebody on death row than it is just to keep them in prison for life. So if the death penalty were taken out of the punishment system as a whole, it would immediately save the U.S. about $5 billion in the next 20 years. And that statistic is also taken from the same article that I used my first point. And then my third point is that the death penalty does not stop crime from happening at once. So for this point, I will be focusing in on two states in specific, which is Texas and Florida, which are states that still have the death penalty. So as Texas became to rise as a death penalty state, instead of lowering the rate crime actually grew by 24%, and the rate of violent crimes in that state grew by 26%. In a spreadsheet that I found from the same website, which was deathpenaltyinfo.org, there was a study that had been released on April of this year that states that there are approximately 354 inmates still on death row in Florida today, but the crime rate in Florida today is still above average. So Florida has a population of about 20.98 million people. The chances of somebody being a victim of a violent crime in Florida is 1 in 200. So taking into consideration how many people inhabit that state, there is still a pretty high chance of someone like you or I becoming a victim of violent crime in that state. So that goes to show that if the death penalty is a way of punishment in Florida, it does not stop crime from happening in that state. So, in conclusion, the death penalty is not an effective way of punishment because it costs more than to keep prisoners in prisons. The police runs a risk of executing innocent people, and it does not stop crime from happening. Thank you.
Okay, the topics identified, your point of view is clearly expressed at the beginning of the speech. There's not really a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be, but as you get to the individual points, you do signpost them pretty clearly, so we can follow the argument that way, and as long as people are listening carefully, they'll be able to see where the argument's going. I do still think that you want to preview the material a little bit more, but in the body of the speech, you did have good signposts on some of these things. Now, the first point that you have basically talks about the risk of execution of an innocent person, and I appreciate that you have some data on people who get convicted of crimes who are later exonerated and are innocent, and 1/3 of them had nothing to do with the crime, I guess, whatsoever. That was a little unclear what that statistic meant. None of that is specific to death penalty cases, and there's not really any explanation about how likely it is that somebody who is convicted of a capital crime where death is the punishment is likely to get through all of the appellate process without the discovery of these kinds of flaws. You don't have an example of somebody who's been executed. There's not any statistical data that applies to the death penalty on that particular point. You kind of have some generic evidence on innocent people being convicted of crimes there. And as you pointed out, the death penalty is somewhat unique. So it's likely to have different standards and rules that are being applied to it. And I would suspect that there would be a lot of reasons to think that innocent people are extremely unlikely to be executed. But the notion that accidents can happen, and in fact that there are cases where this has happened, I mean, I know this, I've heard this argument 1,000 times. I don't say 1,000 times, maybe that's a slight hyperbole. You know what, wait a second, this is 2018. I've been doing this since 1979. Okay, 1,000 times probably. That may very well be the case. You know, the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of evidence that I think you've missed that would have supported your argument a little bit better than what you've got here. The source on the cost of conducting these trials needs to be given. I do know that death penalty cases are more expensive. The number that you're giving in comparison, $74,000 versus $1.26 million, that seems to be a little high in terms of the ratio. I suspect that when we're dealing with capital crimes, maybe the $74,000 is a typical crime as opposed to a non-capital murder case, for instance, one where the death penalty isn't involved. I think that would be the comparison that we would want to have, and that would make a little bit more sense. When you come up with a statistic or a kind of a summary of the data that says we would save $5 billion over 20 years, well, that doesn't, you know, over 20 years, that's not, I'm doing math in my head. I can't do that. $5 billion over 20 years, how much is that each year? 5 billion divided by 20. Somebody? Come on, there's an engineer out there who knows, who can do this in their sleep. Somebody's getting out their calculator. How much? 400 million?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, you're just doing it in your head. Okay. All right. I'll go with that. I'll go with that. I guess that would make sense.
250 million.
250 million. So that's $250 million a year. So then the question becomes, is that $250 million a year, worth whatever investment we put into this? And that's where I think we need to talk a little bit more about what the death penalty cases involve and the people that are involved and what dangers they represent. That's, I think, one of the things that sometimes gets neglected on this argument. $250 million, that's a good deal to you and me, but for the whole country, $250 million, we spend that on paper clips at the federal level. So I'm not exactly sure that's a huge amount, but it's not an unreasonable savings. The comparison in Texas and in Florida that you're using is general crime information, and I think that most people who would either oppose or be in favor of the death penalty would suggest that the death penalty probably has little effect on the general nature of crime, that it's really only related to potential capital cases, and so I think you probably need information that's more specific as a consequence. I thought you had a really solid review of the argument at the end, and you finish off with the position very clearly stated. All right, thank you.